There are things in this world that we're not meant to understand. I know that now, but knowledge, once gained, can't be unlearned. It burrows into your mind like a parasite, changing how you see everything around you. After 17 years as a park ranger at Yellowstone National Park, I've learned too much. The things I've seen, the truths I've uncovered, they've changed me in ways I can't fully explain. My name is David Chen, and this will be my final report. If you're reading this, it means I'm probably already gone. Not dead, at least I hope not, but gone to somewhere beyond our normal understanding of reality. I'm writing this account in hopes that someone will understand what's really happening in our national parks, and maybe, just maybe, find a way to stop what's coming. I should start at the beginning, but the truth is, I'm not sure where the beginning really is. Did it start with the Henderson family disappearance 3 years ago, or with the Native American warnings centuries before, or perhaps it began millions of years ago when something ancient and vast first stirred beneath the Earth's crust, dreaming of the day it would wake again? For simplicity's sake, I'll start with my own story, but remember, what I'm about to tell you isn't just about me or even about Yellowstone. It's about every national park, every dark forest, every deep cave where the boundaries between worlds have grown thin. It's about what's been hiding in plain sight since before humans first walked these lands. And it's about what's finally waking up. The day everything changed started like any other. July 15th, 3 years ago. The summer tourist season was in full swing, and we'd already dealt with the usual array of incidents: selfie-related injuries, tourists trying to pet bison, the occasional lost child. I was working the evening shift with my partner Jake Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the Park Service who'd seen it all, or so we thought. The call came in at 6:47 p.m. A family of 4. The Hendersons hadn't returned from their day hike near Old Faithful. Nothing unusual about that. We got similar calls almost weekly during peak season, but something felt different this time. The weather had been strange all day, with an unusual purple tint to the sky and a heaviness to the air that made it feel like a thunderstorm was brewing, even though our instruments showed clear conditions. Probably just lost track of time, Jake said as we geared up for the search. Bet we find them taking pictures of the sunset. I nodded, but my stomach was already knotting up. The radio was acting strange, picking up interference that sounded almost like whispers. Our GPS units were glitching, showing coordinates that kept shifting slightly every few seconds. Even the search dogs were acting odd, whining and backing away from their handlers. We started at the family's last known location, a popular overlook near the geyser basin. Their rental car was still in the parking lot, a red Ford Explorer with California plates. Inside, everything looked normal. Maps on the dashboard, water bottles in the cup holders, a child stuffed animal in the back seat. But when I touched the hood, it was ice cold. On a summer evening when temperatures had been in the high 80s all day. Jake noticed it too. Maybe they took another car. I checked the parking log. No other vehicles registered to the Henderson family. No ride shares called to the area. They'd started their hike at 2 p.m., planning a simple 3-hour loop trail that thousands of tourists walked every year. We found their first trace about a half-mile down the trail. A smartphone lying in the dirt, its screen cracked but still working. The last photo had been taken at 3:12 p.m., showing the family smiling in front of a thermal pool. But there was something wrong with the image. In the steam behind them, barely visible, was a shape that didn't belong. At first glance, it looked like a tree, but trees don't have that many branches, and they certainly don't bend in those angles. The photo's metadata was corrupted, showing impossible coordinates and a timestamp that read, "Error, invalid timeline reference." As we continued down the trail, the silence began to creep in. If you've never been in a national park, you might think of them as quiet, peaceful places. They're not. They're full of life and sound. Birds calling, insects buzzing, wind in the trees, the constant background noise of thermal activity. But as we went deeper into the gathering dusk, all those sounds began to fade away. Jake noticed it first. "Dave," he whispered, his voice tight. "You hear that?" I stopped walking. "Hear what?" "Exactly." The silence was total, absolute in a way that felt physical, like pressure against my eardrums. Our footsteps made no sound on the gravel path. The steam from nearby vents rose in complete silence. Even our breathing seemed muted, as if the air itself was absorbing all sound. That's when we found the camera. It was lying in the mud near a small steam vent, a high-end DSLR still in perfect condition. The last photo had been taken at 4:27 p.m., less than an hour before sunset. It showed the Hendersons' daughter, Emma, pointing at something in the distance. The image was distorted, like it had been taken through rippling water, but in the background, partially obscured by steam, was something that made my blood run cold. The figure stood at least 8 feet tall, its proportions all wrong. The limbs were too long, jointed in places where joints shouldn't be. The torso was impossibly thin, almost two-dimensional when viewed from the side. But it was the face, or rather where the face should have been, that haunted me. Instead of features, there was just a smooth, reflective surface like black glass. And in that surface, I could see other faces, dozens of them, all screaming silently. Jake took one look at the image and cursed. That's gotta be photoshopped, some kind of prank. But we both knew it wasn't. The camera was an expensive model that shot in RAW format, storing unedited image data. What we were seeing was exactly what the camera had captured. The family's footprints led away from where we found the camera, heading off the marked trail toward an area of the park I knew intimately. I'd patrolled this section for years, mapped every thermal feature, every tree, every rock, which is why what we found next was impossible. The tracks led to the edge of a thermal pool that shouldn't have existed. The thermal pool shouldn't have existed. I'd memorized every feature in this area, walked these paths thousands of times, but here it was, a perfectly circular pool about 30 feet in diameter, filled with water so black it seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. "This isn't right," Jake muttered, keeping his distance from the edge. "There's no steam. Thermal pools always have steam." He was right. Despite the near-freezing temperature that had suddenly descended around us, the water's surface was perfectly still. No steam, no bubbles, no sign of the geothermal activity that powered Yellowstone's other features. But there was something else, a faint luminescence that seemed to come from deep within the pool, pulsing in a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat. Around the pool's edge were markings unlike anything I'd seen in my years of service. They weren't human-made. The symbols seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, like trying to read something written in a language that existed in 4 dimensions. They weren't animal tracks either. The closest comparison I could make was to the patterns left by certain fungi, but these markings seemed to have been burned into the rock, leaving glossy black traces that reflected our flashlight beams in impossible ways. The Henderson family's footprints led right to the pool's edge. 4 sets of tracks in the mud, ending abruptly at the water. No signs of struggle, no scuff marks indicating a fall. It was as if they had simply walked into the water and vanished. "We need backup," Jake said, reaching for his radio. But when he keyed the mic, what came out wasn't static. It was music or something like music. A chorus of voices singing in harmony, but the notes were wrong. The scales impossible for human vocal cords to produce. The sound made my teeth ache and my vision blur. That's when the water began to move. It didn't ripple or wave like normal water. Instead, it began to form patterns, geometric shapes that folded in on themselves, creating depths that shouldn't have been possible. As we watched, transfixed, the patterns began to resolve into images. I saw cities that couldn't exist, built at angles that denied physics. I saw creatures that looked like they'd evolved in environments where our laws of nature didn't apply. And I saw the Hendersons. They were suspended in the black water, but not drowning. Their eyes were open, faces frozen in expressions that mixed terror and ecstasy in equal measure. Around them moved shapes that my mind couldn't, or wouldn't, fully process. Limbs that bent in too many directions. Bodies that seemed to exist in multiple places at once. Faces that were made of geometries that shouldn't be possible in our universe. Jake grabbed my arm. "Dave, look." He pointed to the ground with a trembling finger. Our own footprints, the ones we'd made walking to the pool's edge, were slowly fading away. The rock was absorbing them, like a time-lapse video of erosion sped up to impossible speeds. The singing from the radio grew louder, and with it came a vibration we could feel in our bones. The black water began to rise, not like normal liquid, but in structured columns that ignored gravity. They twisted into shapes that hurt to look at, forming what seemed like a doorway or portal composed entirely of impossible angles. Through that doorway, I caught glimpses of something vast. A city, a being, a universe. Even now, I'm not sure, but I remember the eyes, thousands of them opening all at once, each one containing what looked like a complete galaxy, spinning and burning with ancient knowledge. Jake ran. I don't blame him. The human mind isn't meant to see such things. But I couldn't move. One of the eyes had fixed on me, and in that moment, information flooded into my brain. Images, concepts, mathematical equations that explained the space between spaces. I saw the true history of our world, the beings that had slumbered beneath it since before the first fish crawled onto land. I saw their plans, their purpose, their hunger. I saw what they wanted to turn Earth into. The next thing I remember, I was back at the ranger station. Jake was there too, though he had no memory of how we'd returned. The clock showed 3 a.m. Nearly 6 hours had passed, though it felt like minutes. My clothes were dry, showing no sign that I'd been near water, but in my pocket, I found something. A small black stone covered in the same shifting symbols we'd seen around the pool. When I touched it, I could still hear the singing. The official search for the Henderson family lasted 2 weeks. We brought in teams from other parks, used thermal imaging, had helicopters scanning the area. We found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no signs of what had happened to them. The black pool was gone too. In its place was bare rock, though samples showed chemical compositions that our labs couldn't identify. Jake requested a transfer the next day. Before he left, he pulled me aside. I noticed his hair had gone completely gray. "Don't go digging into this, Dave," he warned. "Some doors aren't meant to be opened. Some knowledge isn't meant for us." But I was already too deep. The black stone in my pocket pulsed with strange energy, and my dreams were filled with those impossible cities and the beings that dwelt in them. I began to notice things I hadn't seen before. Patterns in the way shadow fell across the landscape, rhythms in the park's geothermal activity that seemed to form a kind of mathematical sequence. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything I observed. The symbols from the black pool began appearing elsewhere, carved into tree trunks, etched into rocks, formed by unusual fungal growths, always slightly different when viewed directly, always burning with that strange inner light. The park itself seemed to be changing. Trails would sometimes lead to different destinations than they should have. Caves that had been thoroughly mapped would suddenly reveal new passages. Visitors reported lost time, strange dreams, and glimpses of creatures that couldn't exist. But the most disturbing changes were happening to me. I found myself understanding things I shouldn't. Complex mathematical concepts that described spaces between dimensions. Theoretical physics that went beyond anything humans had discovered. I could read the symbols now, though the knowledge they contained was almost too much for my mind to handle. And I wasn't the only one affected. Other rangers began reporting similar experiences. Some would go missing for hours, returning with no memory of where they'd been but possessing impossible knowledge. Others would quit suddenly, leaving behind journals filled with drawings of those same shifting symbols. The Park Service psychiatrist suggested I take leave, but I knew I couldn't. Something was happening in Yellowstone, something that had been building for millions of years. The black pool wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the first visible sign of a much larger awakening. 6 months after the Henderson incident, it happened again. The Chen family, no relation to me, disappeared near Mammoth Hot Springs. Like the Hendersons, they vanished without a trace, leaving behind a perfectly intact campsite. Their food was still warm on the portable stove, chairs arranged around a smoldering fire. All their belongings, phones, wallets, car keys, were left behind. But this time, I knew what to look for. The symbols were there, burned into the ground in a perfect circle around their tent. The air had that same electric quality I remembered from the black pool, and the silence, that absolute, crushing silence, had descended over the area. As the search party spread out through the woods, I heard it, the singing. It came from deep underground, a harmony of impossible voices that seemed to vibrate at frequencies that shouldn't exist. This time, I understood some of the words. The black stone in my pocket had been teaching me whether I wanted to learn or not. They were singing about the gathering and the great convergence, about specimens and preparations. After the others left, I stayed behind. As twilight approached, the shadows began to move strangely. They didn't match the direction of the light, and some seemed to move independently of their sources. That's when I saw it, a massive shape moving through the forest. It moved like smoke but left footprints that looked like they'd been burned into the ground. The tracks led to a cave entrance that wasn't on any of our maps. Inside the cave, the walls were covered with the symbols. They told a story, not in words, but in concepts that burned themselves directly into my mind. They spoke of beings that had come to Earth when it was young, who had shaped the planet's geology to serve their own unfathomable purposes. The geothermal features of Yellowstone weren't natural formations. They were machinery, parts of a vast system designed to achieve something my human mind could barely comprehend. Near the cave entrance, I found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. It was dated 1922, written by a ranger named Thomas Blackwood. His handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the journal progressed, but what he described matched everything I'd seen. The disappearances are not random. They're collecting them, gathering specimens with specific traits. The symbols are part of a pattern, a vast design spread across not just Yellowstone, but all the national parks. The parks themselves are components of something larger, something that has been growing, building, preparing. God help us all when it's finally ready. The last few pages were filled with the symbols, drawn with such force that the pen had torn through the paper in places. In the margins, Blackwood had written, "They sing to me every night now. They show me things, impossible things. Cities that shouldn't exist. Beings that defy description. And always, always, they show me the final design. What Earth will become when they're finished with it." Blackwood's journal led me down a rabbit hole of research. I spent my off hours in libraries and archives looking for similar incidents throughout the park's history. What I found was disturbing. Every 27 years, there would be a spike in disappearances, always following the same pattern: strange symbols, unexplained singing, and witnesses describing impossible creatures. The pattern went back further than the park's establishment. Native American tribes who had lived in the area had extensive warnings about these places. The Blackfeet called them the Thin Places, where the boundary between worlds had worn down. The Crow spoke of star people who would emerge from pools of black water to collect humans for some unknown purpose. The Shoshone had elaborate rituals to avoid attracting their attention. I found photographs from the 1800s showing the same symbols I'd seen by the Black Pool. In one image from 1895, a group of surveyors posed in front of a cave entrance. In the background, barely visible, was a figure that matched exactly what we'd seen in the Henderson family's last photo. Impossibly tall, wrongly proportioned, with that same reflective surface where a face should be. But the most chilling discovery came from a set of geological surveys from the 1950s. The surveyor, Dr. Sarah Martinez, had mapped unusual magnetic anomalies throughout Yellowstone. When I overlaid her maps with the locations of known disappearances, they formed a pattern, a vast geometric design that spanned the entire park. The same pattern was repeated in other national parks across the country. What I discovered in Dr. Martinez's surveys changed everything. The pattern wasn't just in Yellowstone, it extended across all major national parks in North America. Each park represented a node in a vast geometric network, its boundaries precisely calculated to form part of a larger design. I began corresponding with rangers at other parks, careful to keep my inquiries subtle. The responses were chilling. In Yosemite, hikers reported finding impossibly geometric structures deep in the wilderness, crystalline formations that seemed to pulse with inner light. At Glacier National Park, there were the Whistling Caves, where people would vanish, leaving behind only strange symbols burned into the rock. The Great Smoky Mountains had stories of lights that would lead travelers to places that shouldn't exist. A ranger from Mount Rainier sent me a confidential report about a search and rescue operation from 2019. They'd found a hiker's camera containing photos of what appeared to be a city built into the mountain's interior, vast halls and spires made of some black, glossy material that seemed to absorb light. The photos became progressively stranger, showing entities that seemed to phase in and out of reality itself. The final image was just a series of symbols, identical to those I'd seen at the Black Pool. But it was the message from a ranger at Death Valley that truly frightened me. She described finding a cave system that, according to all geological surveys, couldn't exist. Inside, they discovered what appeared to be some kind of machinery, massive crystalline structures arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. The structures seemed to be growing, slowly reshaping the surrounding rock into more of themselves. The ranger included a photograph that made my blood run cold. The crystals were covered in the same symbols I'd been studying, but there was something else, a reflection in one of the crystalline surfaces. It showed a vast chamber that wasn't there, filled with rows upon rows of transparent containers. Inside each container was a human figure, suspended in black fluid. My research attracted attention. One morning, I found an unmarked envelope in my mailbox containing classified documents from the 1960s. Project Obsidian, they called it, a secret government investigation into the strange phenomena in national parks. The files revealed that the government had been aware of the situation for decades. They had teams of scientists studying the symbols, the disappearances, the strange magnetic anomalies. They discovered that the patterns formed by the park boundaries created a kind of resonance frequency with something deep beneath the Earth's crust. But the most disturbing revelation came from a series of seismological studies. Whatever was down there was growing. The crystalline structures found in various parks weren't just spreading, they were transforming the surrounding rock, gradually converting Earth's geology into something else, something alien. The final page of the documents contained a warning from the project's lead scientist. These beings aren't invading our world, they're transforming it. The national parks aren't preserves, they're incubators. Each disappearance, each manifestation, each symbol carved into stone is part of a vast terraforming project that began millions of years ago. We're not witnessing an invasion, we're witnessing a metamorphosis. As I pieced together these discoveries, changes were happening across all the parks. Rangers reported increasing instances of temporal anomalies. Areas where time seemed to flow differently. Hikers would emerge from short trails having aged days or weeks. Others would return with memories of places that didn't exist, or speaking languages that had never been heard before. The symbols began appearing more frequently, forming complex patterns that seemed to ripple and shift when no one was looking directly at them. Visitors reported strange dreams, visions of vast underground cities and beings that spoke in colors and geometries rather than words. But the most significant changes were happening to me. The black stone I'd found was changing me, teaching me things I shouldn't know. I began to understand the true purpose of the symbols. They weren't just writing, they were instructions. Each one was a piece of code in an unimaginably vast program designed to rewrite the fundamental laws of our reality. I could see them now, the beings behind it all. They existed in dimensions our minds couldn't fully perceive, but they were everywhere, in the spaces between atoms, in the gaps between moments, in the geometries that our mathematics couldn't describe. They weren't malevolent, not exactly. We were simply part of their planned specimens to be studied, cataloged, and preserved as they transformed our world into something that could sustain their true forms. Last week, everything accelerated. The symbols began appearing everywhere, not just in the parks, but in cities, on buildings, in the patterns of clouds in the sky. The singing became constant, a worldwide chorus that most people couldn't consciously hear but felt in their bones. Animals began behaving strangely, gathering in geometric patterns and staring at things nobody else could see. I found another black pool, bigger than the first. This time, I understood what I was seeing. The water wasn't water at all. It was a thin place, a membrane between dimensions where reality had worn thin. Through its surface, I could see their world clearly now. The impossible cities I'd glimpsed before were just small outposts of their civilization. Their true realm was vast beyond comprehension, a universe of angles and geometries that our minds couldn't process. The beings showed me their plan. Every disappearance, every strange incident, every symbol carved into stone was part of a vast catalog. They were collecting specimens, not just humans, but samples of every form of life on Earth, preserving them before the Great Change began. The national parks weren't just containment sites or observation posts. They were anchor points, places where the transformation would begin. The symbols formed a program, a set of instructions written into the fabric of reality itself. When the pattern was complete, it would trigger a metamorphosis on a planetary scale. This is my final entry. The symbols have reached my cabin now. They crawl across the walls like living things, rearranging themselves into patterns that make my eyes bleed. The black stone has become part of my hand, its crystalline structure spreading slowly up my arm. Through it, I can feel them moving beneath the Earth's crust, vast shapes stirring in anticipation. The government files were wrong about one thing. This isn't a terraforming project. Earth was never ours to begin with. We're not being invaded or colonized. We're being remembered. The beings that sleep beneath our national parks were here long before us. Their consciousness spread through the rocks and waters of this planet. Everything we know, the mountains, the forests, the laws of physics themselves, is just a temporary configuration, a holding pattern until they were ready to wake up. And now they're waking up. I can hear them coming. The walls of my cabin are dissolving into geometries that shouldn't exist. The air itself is splitting open, revealing the true nature of space and time. Through the cracks, I can see their world bleeding into ours. It's beautiful and horrible and impossible and true. To anyone who finds this, don't look for me. Don't look for any of us who've disappeared. We're beyond finding now. We're part of their collection, preserved for whatever comes next. The transformation can't be stopped. It was written into the Earth's bones before the first humans ever walked upright. The parks were never meant to preserve nature. They were meant to preserve us, small samples of humanity kept safe in their vast museum before they reclaimed what was always theirs. I have to end this now. The symbols have reached my desk, and the singing is so loud I can barely think. The black pool is forming in my room, and through it I can see what's coming, what's always been coming. The great design is complete. And as I write these final words, I realize a terrible truth. We were never the dominant species on Earth. We were just part of their garden, growing in the thin soil of reality they left for us, waiting to be harvested. The last thing I see before the darkness takes me is my reflection in the black water. I'm smiling, not because I want to, but because the thing wearing my face has forgotten how human muscles work. Remember, if you're in the parks and you hear singing that makes your teeth ache and your shadows move the wrong way, don't run, don't hide. It's already too late. They've always been here. They are here now. And soon, very soon, there will be nothing left but their world. And somewhere in a vast collection of preserved specimens, humanity will dream of a time when we thought we were alone in the universe, when we thought we were free,